My name is Anna. I'm 36 years old, and I thought I knew what heartbreak felt like until my ex-husband tried to steal my daughter's love from me. This morning, as I was making Sophie's favorite chocolate chip pancakes before my early shift at the diner, my 8-year-old daughter looked up at me with those big brown eyes and asked, "Mommy, why doesn't Daddy live with us anymore? He says you made him go away." My heart stopped. In that moment, I realized my ex-husband Brandon wasn't just gone from our lives. He was actively poisoning my little girl against me. Before I tell you how this emotional war nearly destroyed both me and my little girl, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button if you've ever felt like you were fighting an invisible battle for your child's heart. Subscribe if you want to hear how a working mom fought back against manipulation. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare began. I met Brandon 7 years ago at a coffee shop in downtown Austin, Texas. He was this charming software engineer with kind eyes and a gentle laugh. I was working as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm, and we clicked instantly. Our first date lasted 12 hours because neither of us wanted it to end. When he proposed 2 years later at our favorite spot by Lady Bird Lake, I truly believed we'd build the perfect family together. Sophie came into our world when I was 28, and those first few years felt like a fairy tale. Brandon would come home from his tech job and immediately take over diaper duty so I could shower. He'd read bedtime stories in funny voices that made Sophie giggle until she hiccuped. We had our little traditions: Sunday morning pancakes, Friday movie nights, weekend trips to the farmer's market where Sophie would charm vendors into giving her free samples of honey and berries. But life has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. In late 2019, Brandon's company went through massive layoffs. He lost his job right before the holidays, and what started as temporary stress became something much darker. At first, I tried to be supportive. I told him we'd figure things out together, that my income could carry us while he looked for new opportunities. I even picked up freelance projects in the evenings to help with expenses. But Brandon didn't look for work. Not really. He'd spend hours on his computer claiming he was networking or applying for positions, but I'd catch glimpses of gaming forums and social media. When I'd gently ask about his job search, he'd snap at me. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under, Anna. I'm trying to find something that matches my skill level, not just any random job like you're suggesting." The drinking started gradually. A beer with lunch became 2 beers. 2 beers became a 6-pack. When I expressed concern, he accused me of not being supportive during his difficult time. "Other wives encourage their husbands," he'd say, "but you're always criticizing me." These weren't the words of the man who used to bring me coffee in bed and tell me I was his best friend. Our arguments became more frequent and more heated. Brandon would blame me for everything: the bills, his inability to find work, even Sophie's occasional tantrums. "If you weren't always stressed about money," he'd say, "maybe this house would be a more positive environment for job hunting." The worst part was when these fights happened in front of Sophie. She'd retreat to her room, and I'd find her later playing with her dolls, making them argue in tiny voices. The final breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. I'd worked late to finish a rush project for a client, hoping the extra payment would cover our mortgage that month. I came home to find Brandon passed out on the couch, empty beer bottles scattered around, and Sophie trying to make herself a peanut butter sandwich for dinner. She was only 7 years old. "Daddy said he'd make dinner," Sophie whispered. "But he's been sleeping for a long time." When I tried to wake Brandon, he became belligerent, yelling about how I was never home, how I'd abandoned my family for work. Sophie started crying, and that's when I knew. This wasn't the man I married, and more importantly, this wasn't the father Sophie deserved. The divorce process took 8 grueling months. Brandon fought me on everything from property division to custody arrangements. He hired an expensive lawyer using money I didn't even know we had, probably from credit cards I'd later discover. In the end, the court awarded me primary custody, with Brandon getting visitation rights every other weekend and one evening during the week. I had to sell our house. The mortgage was too much for my income alone, especially with legal fees draining our savings. Sophie and I moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment across town. It wasn't much, but it was ours, and most importantly, it was peaceful. No more yelling, no more walking on eggshells, no more finding empty bottles hidden in closets. To make ends meet, I took a second job. Mornings at Sunrise Diner, slinging coffee and eggs for the breakfast crowd, then evenings doing freelance graphic design work after Sophie went to bed. It was exhausting, but I told myself it was temporary. Once the divorce was finalized, and I could establish some stability, things would get easier. I was wrong. The real war was just beginning. The first weekend Sophie spent at Brandon's new apartment, she came home different. Not dramatically different, just small changes that only a mother would notice. She was quieter during dinner, more clingy at bedtime, and she kept asking odd questions. "Mommy," she said while I braided her hair for school. "Daddy says you didn't want him to come home. Is that true?" My hands stilled in her hair. I chose my words carefully, explaining that sometimes adults can't live together anymore, but it doesn't mean anyone is bad. Sophie nodded, but I could see confusion in her eyes. The questions became more pointed over the following weeks. "Why do you have to work so much? Daddy says good mommies stay home with their kids." This one hit hard because I'd been struggling with guilt about my work schedule. I was doing everything I could to provide for us, but Brandon was twisting my efforts into evidence that I was somehow failing as a mother. "Daddy's new apartment has a big TV and lots of toys," Sophie mentioned casually one evening. "Why is our place so small?" I looked around our modest apartment with its secondhand furniture and Sophie's small bedroom and felt my heart sink. Brandon was making comparisons, setting up a competition where I was destined to lose. The changes in Sophie's behavior became more noticeable. She started pushing back when I asked her to do homework, saying, "Daddy doesn't make me do homework right away." When I enforced our 8:30 bedtime, she'd protest. "Daddy lets me stay up late and eat ice cream for dinner." Every rule, every routine I'd established was being undermined by reports of how much more fun life was at Daddy's house. I tried talking to Brandon about it. I called him one evening after Sophie was asleep and carefully explained that she seemed confused by the different rules at our houses. "Maybe we could coordinate better," I suggested. "Make things more consistent for her sake." "I don't know what you're talking about, Anna," he said, his tone cold. "Sophie's perfectly fine when she's with me. Maybe the problem is your parenting style, not mine. Kids need fun in their lives, not just rules and chores." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. That night I lay awake wondering if I was being paranoid. Maybe Brandon was right. Maybe I was too strict, too focused on structure and responsibility. Maybe Sophie really was happier at her father's place. The doubt crept in like poison, making me question every decision I made as a mother. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The Sophie who came home from Brandon's visits wasn't just happy and relaxed. She was conflicted, anxious, and increasingly distant from me. She'd flinch when I tried to hug her, as if affection from me was somehow wrong. She'd look at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between suspicion and disappointment. I started dreading the Sunday evening pickups. Sophie would drag her feet getting ready, and when Brandon arrived, she'd run to him with an enthusiasm that felt forced, like she was performing for his approval. "I missed you so much, Daddy," she'd say loudly, making sure I could hear. "I don't want to stay here anymore." Each time I'd watch my daughter slip away from me a little more, and I felt helpless to stop it. Brandon would stand in my doorway, with a satisfied smile, his hand protectively on Sophie's shoulder, and I'd see exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just visiting his daughter. He was recruiting her to his side in a war I didn't even know we were fighting. 2 months after the divorce was finalized, the woman my daughter was becoming broke my heart daily. Sophie no longer ran to me when I came home from work. She'd barely look up from whatever she was doing, offering only a mumbled hi before returning to her activities. The warm hugs and excited stories about her day were replaced by cold shoulders and one-word answers. "How was school today, sweetheart?" I'd ask, genuinely wanting to connect with her. "Fine," she'd reply without looking at me. "What did you learn in art class? Nothing important? Would you like to help me make dinner? I don't want to talk about it." The little girl who used to chatter nonstop about her friends, her teachers, her dreams, had become a stranger in our own home. She'd sit at the dinner table picking at her food while I desperately tried to start conversations that went nowhere. Bath time became a battle. Bedtime stories were refused. Even our weekend traditions like Saturday morning cartoons and pancakes were met with disinterest. "I don't really like pancakes anymore," Sophie announced one Saturday morning. "Daddy makes better breakfast anyway." It was around this time that Brandon started sending me text messages that seemed helpful on the surface, but carried subtle threats underneath. "Sophie seems really stressed when she comes back to me," one read. "Maybe you should consider if this living situation is best for her emotional well-being." Another said, "I've noticed Sophie's grades have dropped since the move. Children need stability, Anna. Just something to think about." I later discovered that Brandon was keeping detailed notes about every conversation he had with Sophie, every complaint she made about life at my house, every sign of unhappiness he could document. He was building a case, gathering evidence to prove that I was an unfit mother and that Sophie would be better off living with him full-time. Meanwhile, I was drowning in my attempts to provide for us. I increased my hours at the diner, taking extra shifts whenever they were available. The tips weren't great, but every dollar mattered. After my morning shift, I'd race home to spend a few hours with Sophie before starting my evening freelance work. Graphic design projects that used to take me 3 hours now stretched late into the night because I was exhausted and couldn't concentrate. I was working from 6 in the morning until 11 at night, 7 days a week. I told myself it was temporary, that once I built up more freelance clients or found a better paying position, I could cut back. But Brandon's child support payments were irregular and often late, leaving me constantly scrambling to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and Sophie's school expenses. The cruel irony was that the harder I worked to provide for Sophie, the more ammunition I was giving Brandon to use against me. My absence became proof that I didn't prioritize my daughter. My exhaustion became evidence that I couldn't handle the responsibility of single motherhood. Every sacrifice I made to build a better life for us was twisted into a reason why Sophie would be better off somewhere else. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late fall. I'd been working on a rush project for a client who needed a complete branding package by Friday morning. The deadline meant the difference between paying our electric bill on time or facing disconnection. I worked until 2 in the morning, finally crawling into bed for a few hours of sleep before my diner shift. When I came home that afternoon, Sophie was sitting at the kitchen table with her homework spread out, but she wasn't working on it. She was just staring at the papers with tears in her eyes. "What's wrong, baby?" I asked immediately, kneeling beside her chair. Sophie looked at me with more pain than any 8-year-old should carry. "Daddy's right," she whispered. "You don't care about me anymore. You only care about work. You're never here, and when you are here, you're always tired and grumpy. I wish Daddy could come back home so things could be normal again." Her words cut through me like a blade. I tried to explain that I was working hard for both of us, that every hour at the diner and every late-night project was because I loved her and wanted to give her a good life. But Sophie had already made up her mind. She gathered her homework and walked to her room, closing the door with a finality that echoed through our small apartment. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table and cried harder than I had since the day I decided to leave Brandon. My daughter was slipping away from me, and the man who had already broken my heart was now breaking hers too, all while making me the villain in her story. 3 months into our new reality, I received a phone call that shattered what was left of my composure. It was Mrs. Patterson, Sophie's 3rd-grade teacher, and her voice carried the careful concern that educators use when they're about to deliver bad news. "Mrs. Johnson," she began, using my maiden name that I'd reclaimed after the divorce. "I wanted to touch base about Sophie. She's been having some emotional difficulties at school. Today, during reading time, she started crying and couldn't stop. When I asked what was wrong, she said that her mommy doesn't love her anymore because she's always working." My throat tightened as Mrs. Patterson continued. "Sophie also mentioned that she wishes she could live with her daddy all the time because he has more time for her. I thought you should know so we can work together to help her through this transition." After hanging up, I made a decision that terrified me but felt necessary. I drove to Brandon's apartment complex, a newer development with amenities I could never afford. His unit was on the 2nd floor with a balcony and a view of the community pool. When he answered the door, he looked genuinely surprised to see me. "Anna, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk about Sophie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "She's struggling at school, and I think we need to figure out how to help her adjust to all these changes." Brandon invited me in, and I was immediately struck by how different his life had become. The apartment was spacious and well-furnished, with a large flat-screen TV and gaming setup in the living room. Sophie's weekend bag was sitting on the couch next to a brand-new iPad still in its box. "Nice place," I said, unable to hide the edge in my voice. "Thanks, I wanted Sophie to be comfortable when she visits." He gestured to the iPad. "Actually, I was just about to give her this. She mentioned that some of her classmates have tablets for their schoolwork." "Brandon, we can't compete with each other through gifts," I said carefully. "Sophie is confused enough without us sending mixed messages about what's important." His expression shifted, becoming cooler. "I'm not sending mixed messages, Anna. I'm providing for my daughter. Maybe if you weren't so focused on punishing me through our custody arrangement, Sophie wouldn't be struggling so much." Punishing you? The accusation caught me off guard. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm trying to build a stable life for Sophie. A stable life? Brandon laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean dragging her to some rundown apartment while you work multiple jobs and barely have time to help with her homework? Come on, Anna. Be honest about what's really going on here. I felt my temper rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. What's really going on is that Sophie needs consistency from both of her parents. She needs to know that we can co-parent without undermining each other. I'm not undermining anything, Brandon said, his voice taking on that familiar manipulative tone I remembered from our marriage. I'm being honest with my daughter about the reality of her situation. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should examine why. Before I could respond, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The faint echo of my own voice, muffled and distorted, coming from Brandon's phone. He'd been recording our conversation. Are you seriously recording me right now? I asked, incredulous. Brandon didn't even look embarrassed. I document all of our interactions, Anna, for Sophie's sake, in case there are any disputes later about what was said or agreed upon. I realized in that moment that this wasn't a conversation between two parents trying to help their child. This was an interrogation designed to gather evidence for whatever legal strategy Brandon was planning. Every word I'd spoken, every emotion I'd shown, was being preserved as potential ammunition against me. When I arrived to pick up Sophie that evening, the scene that unfolded will haunt me forever. Sophie saw me coming up the walkway and immediately started crying. I don't want to go home with you, she screamed, wrapping her arms around Brandon's waist. I want to stay with Daddy. Why can't you just let him come back home? Why do you have to be so mean? Other residents of the apartment complex had come out onto their balconies, drawn by the commotion. I stood there humiliated and heartbroken, while my 8-year-old daughter publicly rejected me. Brandon made a show of comforting her, whispering things in her ear that only made her cry harder. Sophie, sweetheart, I said, kneeling down to her level. I know this is hard, but we need to go home now. We can talk about your feelings in the car. No, she sobbed. I hate going to your house. It's small and sad, and you're never there anyway. Daddy says maybe I can live here all the time if I want to. The words hit me like physical blows. This wasn't my daughter speaking. These were Brandon's words, filtered through her young voice and delivered with the devastating innocence of childhood. He had poisoned her mind so thoroughly that she genuinely believed I was the source of all her unhappiness. The drive home was silent except for Sophie's sniffling in the back seat. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping to catch her eye, hoping to see some flicker of the little girl who used to tell me I was her best friend. But she stared out the window with the same distant expression that had become her default around me. That night, I lay in bed listening to Sophie talk on the phone with Brandon. Their conversation drifted through the thin walls of our apartment, and every word was like a dagger to my heart. Daddy, I wish Mommy would just let you come home, she whispered. I told her what you said about how much you miss us, but she won't listen. I think she likes being mean to you. I pressed my pillow over my head, trying to block out the sound of my daughter's voice expressing thoughts that weren't her own. Brandon was using her as a weapon against me, and she was too young to understand that she was being manipulated. In her mind, I was the villain who had broken up our family, and he was the victim who just wanted us all to be together again. That night was the darkest of my life. I questioned everything. Maybe I had been too hasty in divorcing Brandon. Maybe I should have tried harder to make the marriage work. Maybe Sophie really would be better off living with her father full-time. The doubt consumed me, fed by exhaustion, isolation, and the devastating experience of watching my own child turn against me. In my desperation, I turned to the internet, searching for answers to questions I didn't even know how to ask. I typed "child hates mother after divorce" into Google at 2 a.m, scrolling through forum posts from other parents describing similar situations. That's when I first encountered the term parental alienation. As I read article after article, case study after case study, I felt a mix of relief and horror. Relief, because what was happening to Sophie and me had a name, a documented pattern that other families had survived. Horror, because I realized how deliberate and calculated Brandon's campaign had been. Parental alienation, I learned, is a form of psychological manipulation where one parent systematically turns a child against the other parent. It involves planting seeds of doubt, rewriting family history, and gradually convincing the child that the targeted parent is harmful, unloving, or dangerous. The techniques Brandon was using, the gradual escalation of Sophie's rejection of me, even the timing of his most damaging comments, all followed a predictable pattern. I spent hours reading testimonials from other mothers who had lost their children to manipulative ex-partners. Some had fought back successfully. Others had endured years of estrangement before their children were old enough to recognize the manipulation. A few had lost their children permanently, unable to compete with the more permissive entertaining parent who offered short-term pleasure over long-term stability. Armed with this knowledge, I made two crucial phone calls. The first was to Dr. Elena Martinez, a child psychologist who specialized in custody disputes and parental alienation. The second was to Patricia Hawkins, a family law attorney who had experience modifying custody arrangements in cases of documented manipulation. Dr. Martinez was able to see me within the week. Her office was warm and comfortable, filled with children's artwork and soft lighting that immediately put me at ease. She listened without judgment as I described the changes in Sophie's behavior, the escalating rejection, and Brandon's role in undermining our relationship. "What you're describing sounds very consistent with parental alienation syndrome," Dr. Martinez said gently. "The good news is that it's not irreversible, especially in a child Sophie's age. Children want to love both their parents naturally. When that love becomes conflicted, it's usually because someone is interfering with the child's natural feelings." She explained that recovery would take time and consistency. Instead of defending myself against Sophie's accusations or trying to compete with Brandon's permissive parenting style, I needed to focus on creating positive experiences and rebuilding trust. She also recommended that we start documenting everything, not to use against Brandon necessarily, but to track Sophie's emotional state and progress. The consultation with Patricia Hawkins was more sobering. She reviewed the original custody agreement and explained that modifying it would require substantial evidence of harm to Sophie. Courts are reluctant to restrict a parent's access to their child without clear proof that the relationship is damaging. However, she said, if we can document a pattern of parental alienation, and if we can show that it's affecting Sophie's emotional well-being, we may be able to request supervised visitation or require co-parenting classes. I began keeping a detailed journal of every interaction with Sophie, every comment she made about her father, every change in behavior after visits. I noted her sleeping patterns, her academic performance, her social interactions at school. The documentation process was painful because it forced me to confront how much ground I'd lost, but it was also empowering because I was finally taking action. More importantly, I changed my approach with Sophie entirely. Instead of trying to explain why her father was wrong or defending my choices as a mother, I focused on validation and connection. When she said she missed having Daddy at home, I said, "I understand that must feel confusing and sad." When she criticized our apartment, I said, "What would make your room feel more comfortable for you?" I stopped trying to compete with Brandon's gifts and entertainment. Instead, I focused on presence. Every moment I wasn't working, I was fully available to Sophie. No phone, no distractions, just quality time together. We started taking walks after dinner, talking about her day without any agenda other than listening. We cooked simple meals together on weekends, letting her choose the menu and help with preparation. The changes were subtle at first. Sophie stopped flinching when I tried to hug her. She began volunteering small details about school without being prompted. One evening, she actually laughed at one of my silly jokes during dinner, and the sound was like music after weeks of silence. I also made a strategic decision to reduce my working hours, even though it meant financial strain. I found a part-time position with a local marketing firm that offered better pay than the diner, though fewer hours overall. The trade-off was worth it because it meant being home when Sophie got out of school and having energy for our evening routine. As my relationship with Sophie began to slowly improve, I carefully documented every positive interaction, every sign of progress, every moment that proved our bond was still there beneath the layers of manipulation. I was building a case not just for the court, but for my daughter's future emotional health. The healing process wasn't linear. Some days Sophie would seem like her old self, chatty and affectionate. Other days, usually after phone calls with Brandon, she'd retreat back into cold distance. But gradually, the good days began to outnumber the bad ones, and I started to believe that we could survive this nightmare together. 6 months after I first learned about parental alienation, I had enough documented evidence to file a motion with the family court. Dr. Martinez provided a comprehensive evaluation of Sophie's emotional state, clearly outlining how Brandon's behavior was affecting our daughter's psychological well-being. Patricia Hawkins compiled witness statements from Sophie's teacher school counselor and even neighbors who had observed the changes in her behavior. The court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late spring. I'd never been more nervous in my life, knowing that the outcome would determine not just my custody rights, but potentially my entire future relationship with my daughter. Brandon arrived with his expensive attorney, looking confident and polished. He wore a tailored suit and carried a leather briefcase, projecting the image of a successful father fighting for his child's best interests. I sat with Patricia in my best dress, a simple outfit I'd owned for years, acutely aware of how the financial disparity between us might appear to the judge. The proceedings began with testimony from Dr. Martinez. She presented her findings clearly and professionally, explaining how parental alienation works and documenting the specific behaviors she'd observed in Sophie. She described the child's conflicted emotions, her anxiety around loyalty issues, and the way her statements about me often sounded rehearsed or coached. In my professional opinion, Dr. Martinez testified, Sophie is being subjected to a deliberate campaign designed to damage her relationship with her mother. This is not a case of a child naturally preferring one parent's lifestyle over another. This is systematic psychological manipulation that is causing significant emotional harm. Brandon's attorney tried to discredit Dr. Martinez's findings, suggesting that Sophie's behavior could be explained by the natural stress of divorce and adjustment to a new living situation. But when Patricia presented recordings of Brandon's phone calls with Sophie, conversations where he clearly planted negative ideas about me and encouraged her loyalty conflicts, the evidence became undeniable. The most damaging evidence was a recorded conversation where Brandon told Sophie, "Mommy works so much because she cares more about money than spending time with you. If she really loved you, she'd find a way to be home more." In another recording, he said, "I've been thinking that maybe you'd be happier living with me all the time. What do you think about that? We could have so much more fun together." Judge Harrison listened to everything with the measured attention of someone who had seen too many families torn apart by custody battles. When it was time for Brandon's testimony, his demeanor shifted from confident to defensive. Under cross-examination, he couldn't explain why he'd been recording conversations with Sophie, or justify some of the more manipulative statements captured on audio. "Mr. Stevens," Judge Harrison said during the questioning, "can you explain to the court why you felt it was appropriate to tell an 8-year-old child that her mother cares more about money than about her?" Brandon's answer was rambling and unconvincing. "I was just trying to help Sophie understand why her living situation had changed. Children deserve honesty about their circumstances." "And do you believe that encouraging a child to question her mother's love constitutes honest communication?" the judge pressed. The hearing lasted 4 hours, but the outcome was clear before it ended. Judge Harrison ordered Brandon to attend co-parenting counseling and anger management classes. His visitation rights were modified to supervised visits for 3 months, with the possibility of returning to unsupervised visits if he completed his required classes and demonstrated appropriate behavior. Most importantly, I was awarded primary custody, with a stronger legal framework that prohibited either parent from making disparaging comments about the other in front of Sophie. Brandon's reaction to the ruling was explosive. As we left the courthouse, he followed me to the parking lot, shouting about how I'd manipulated the system and turned the courts against him. "This isn't over, Anna," he said, his voice carrying the same threatening tone I remembered from our worst fights. "I'll appeal this decision, and I'll make sure Sophie knows exactly what kind of mother you really are." Patricia had warned me that Brandon might escalate his behavior initially, and she was right. He sent angry text messages threatening legal action and questioning my fitness as a parent. But he was legally required to comply with the court order or face consequences that could include losing his visitation rights entirely. The real test came when I picked Sophie up from her first supervised visit. The court-appointed supervisor, Mrs. Chen, briefed me on how the visit had gone. "Mr. Stevens seemed frustrated by the supervision," she reported. "He made several attempts to discuss the court proceedings with Sophie, but I redirected those conversations. Overall, Sophie appeared more relaxed than I expected. Sophie was quiet during the drive home, but it was a different kind of silence than before. She wasn't radiating anger or resentment. She just seemed thoughtful, like she was processing something important. "How was your visit with Daddy?" I asked gently. "It was okay," she said, which was more positive than I'd expected. "Mrs. Chen was nice. Daddy seemed upset about something, but he wouldn't tell me what." Daddy. That evening, Sophie and I had one of our most honest conversations since the divorce. I didn't initiate it. She did, climbing into my bed at bedtime, instead of going to her own room. "Mommy," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about some things Daddy told me, and I don't think they were all true." My heart raced, but I kept my voice calm. "What kinds of things, sweetheart? Like when he said you didn't want him to come home. I remember the night he was yelling and you were crying and you told him he needed to leave until he could be nicer. You didn't want him to go away forever. You just wanted him to stop being mean." I held my breath as Sophie continued. "And he said you work so much because you don't want to spend time with me. But I know you work because we need money for food and rent and my school things." Mrs. Patterson told us about single moms in class and how they have to work extra hard to take care of their families. "You're a very smart girl," I said, smoothing her hair back from her face. "It's okay to have confused feelings about all of this. Divorce is complicated even for grown-ups." "I'm sorry I said those mean things to you, Mommy," Sophie whispered. "I was mad about Daddy leaving, but that wasn't your fault. I love you, and I know you love me too." We both cried that night, but they were healing tears washing away months of pain and misunderstanding. For the first time since the divorce, I felt like I had my daughter back. The healing process took 6 months of family therapy with Dr. Martinez. But gradually, Sophie began to understand how she'd been manipulated. Children are remarkably resilient, and once the external pressure to choose sides was removed, Sophie's natural love for both her parents began to reassert itself. Brandon completed his required classes and eventually returned to unsupervised visitation, but under strict guidelines about appropriate conversation topics. The supervised period had forced him to interact with Sophie without the ability to poison her mind against me, and surprisingly, it had improved their relationship too. When he couldn't use their time together to complain about me, he had to focus on actually connecting with his daughter. Dr. Martinez worked with all 3 of us separately, and together helping Sophie process her confused emotions and teaching both Brandon and me healthier communication strategies. Sophie learned that loving both her parents wasn't disloyal to either of us, and that she wasn't responsible for fixing our adult problems. I understand now that Daddy was sad about the divorce, and sometimes when people are sad, they say things that aren't fair, Sophie told me during one of our sessions. But that doesn't mean I have to be sad too, or that I have to pick who I love more. The change in our home was remarkable. Sophie's academic performance improved dramatically. She started sleeping through the night again. She made new friends at school and began participating in after-school activities. Most importantly, she became a happy, confident child again, secure in the knowledge that both her parents loved her even if they couldn't live together anymore. Brandon and I will never be friends, but we learned to co-parent effectively. Our communication became businesslike and focused on Sophie's needs rather than our past grievances. He still occasionally tests boundaries, but I've become skilled at redirecting conversations back to practical matters and documenting anything that seems manipulative. I also made significant changes in my own life. The new marketing position led to a promotion within a year, providing better financial stability and a more manageable work schedule. Sophie and I moved to a larger apartment in a better school district, and for the first time since the divorce, I felt like we were thriving rather than just surviving. 1 year after the court hearing, Sophie chose to write about our family for a school project on overcoming challenges. She wrote, "My parents got divorced, and it was really hard at first because I didn't understand what was happening. I thought I had to choose who to love, but my therapist taught me that love isn't like that. Now I live with my mom most of the time, and I visit my dad on weekends. My mom works hard to take care of us, and my dad is learning to be a better listener. I'm happy because I know they both love me, and that's what really matters." Reading her words, I realized that we'd not only survived Brandon's attempt to turn her against me, we'd emerged stronger and more connected than before. Sophie had learned valuable lessons about manipulation, emotional boundaries, and the difference between love and loyalty that would serve her well throughout her life. Brandon still sees Sophie regularly, and their relationship has actually improved now that it's not built on negativity toward me. He's learned that he can be a good father without being a destructive ex-husband, and Sophie benefits from having positive relationships with both her parents. Looking back on this journey, I realized that the 2 years following my divorce were the most challenging and transformative of my life. When I first heard Sophie question my love for her, when I watched my own daughter reject me based on lies her father had planted, I thought my world was ending. There were nights I wondered if I was strong enough to fight for her, moments when Brandon's manipulation made me question my own worth as a mother. But I learned something crucial during those dark months. Love isn't just a feeling, It's a choice you make every day, especially when that choice becomes difficult. Every morning, I chose to wake up and fight for my daughter's heart, even when she couldn't see that fight. Every evening, I chose patience over defensiveness, understanding over anger, hope over despair. Today, Sophie is 10 years old, confident and emotionally healthy. She's learned to navigate the complexities of having divorced parents without losing herself in the process. She knows that families can take many different forms and that love doesn't diminish when it's shared between different homes. Our relationship is stronger now than it was before the divorce, partly because we've been through this trial together and emerged intact. Sophie has seen me at my most vulnerable and watched me fight for something precious. She's learned that mothers aren't perfect, but they can be persistent, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to give up when everything seems hopeless. Brandon has become a better father through this process, though that wasn't my goal. When he was forced to stop using Sophie as a weapon against me, he had to learn how to connect with her as an individual. Their relationship is healthier now because it's based on genuine affection rather than shared resentment. I've also grown tremendously as a person. I've learned to trust my instincts as a mother to seek help when I need it, and to fight smart rather than just fight hard. I've discovered that I'm stronger than I ever imagined, capable of protecting what matters most, even when the battle seems impossible to win. The most important lesson I want to share with other parents facing similar situations is this: your child's love for you is real and deep, even when it's being poisoned by someone else's bitterness. Children have an innate need to love and be loved by both parents. When that natural inclination is disrupted by manipulation, it causes the child tremendous internal conflict. Trust your instincts. If your child's behavior toward you changes dramatically after spending time with your ex-partner, if they start repeating criticisms that sound too mature for their age, if they seem conflicted about showing you affection, pay attention. Document everything, seek professional help early, and don't try to handle it alone. Most importantly, never give up on your child's heart. The manipulation may be loud and persistent, but underneath it, your child's love for you remains constant. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your child is showing them what it looks like to fight for something precious, to persist when everything seems lost, and to choose love over bitterness, even in the face of deliberate cruelty. If you're watching this and you're in the middle of your own battle for your child's heart, I want you to know that you're not alone. Thousands of parents have walked this path before you, and many have emerged victorious. Your love for your child is not weakness. It's the greatest strength you possess. Hold on to it, fight smart, and never ever give up. Have you or someone you know ever experienced parental alienation? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. How did you handle manipulation from an ex-partner? What advice would you give to other parents facing similar challenges? Your experiences could help someone who's struggling right now. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to help other parents find it. Subscribe to my channel for more real stories about overcoming life's biggest challenges. And please share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they're not alone in their fight for their child's love. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that every child deserves to love both their parents without guilt, fear, or manipulation. Sometimes we have to fight to protect that right, but it's always worth it. Stay strong, trust your love, and never give up hope.